Je vais vous présenter Michael Danton, qui est notre speaker suivant. Voilà, il va parler en anglais. Donc, si vous souhaitez un casque, vous allez vite vous en procurer un. Il faut lever la main et on vous en apporte. Vous voyez, c'est encore mieux organisé que ça. Alors, Michael... Voilà, essayez de faire un petit peu silence. Donc, Michael Danton est un chercheur venant de Nouvelle-Zélande qui a travaillé 30 ans dans le domaine de la génétique médicale, en particulier en ophtalmologie, dans les maladies rétiniennes. Et ses travaux ont permis de déboucher sur la première thérapie génique efficace dans le domaine ophtalmologique. Il a travaillé sur les problèmes de génome humain en Inde et s'est intéressé aussi à la biologie évolutionniste, ce qui lui a permis d'aller au-delà des théories darwiniennes et de replacer l'homme et la vie dans l'évolution du cosmos. Michael, it's your turn. Merci.
First, I'd like to say what a pleasure it is to be in Paris. It's always a pleasure being in Paris. And how honored I am to be asked to take part in this particular meet. I've known John and some of the other participants for many years, actually. And it is a real great pleasure to be here again in Paris again. This is a very biological, hopefully very easy to comprehend presentation. And it's going to be my personal journey from functionalism to structuralism. In other words, my basic intellectual journey through life from a mechanistic, functionalist view of nature to away from that view to a new, more naturalistic view of the biological world. First of all, what do I mean by the functionalist worldview? This is based on the presumption that all parts of an organism serve some function, like the parts of a watch, that the prime organizing principle of life is adaptation, that like a machine, organisms are contingent assemblages of components, and that is not determined by physical law, but put together either by an extrinsic creator, an intelligent watchmaker, or natural selection, the blind watchmaker. Now, this functionalist view of the biological world is deeply ingrained in the world of Anglophone biology. However, there was mechanists in other parts of the world as well, and as we're in France, I thought we should perhaps nod to René Descartes, who said, "I desire that you should consider that the functions of the body follow simply from the disposition of the organs as wholly naturally as the movements of a clock or other automaton follow the disposition of its counterweights and wheels." This is from Descartes' Treatise on Man. However, for me, growing up in northern England in a fundamentalist Christian family and believing in special creation, my functionalism can be traced back to John Ray, who was the founding father of English functionalism and the concept of the organism as machine or artifact, an artifact of God. He says in The Wisdom of God, he says, machines, I'll have to put my glasses on, sorry. He said that, in fact, he talks about the wonderful mechanism of the human body, and he talks about such machines. And if you read John Ray, you get an overwhelming feeling of the organism as a machine. Almost every page the word machine is being used in this work of natural theology. But this is one of the first works of English natural theology, and it's functionalism to the hilt. John Ray was a supreme panadaptationalist, functionalist, and a mechanist. In his Wisdom of God manifest in the works of creation, he comments on the design of the body, and this is pure adaptationalism, that every single part of an organism has to serve some function. The body of man may thence be proved to be the effect of wisdom because there is nothing in its deficit, nothing superfluous, nothing but hath its end and use. And about the eye, he comments, "We shall find this structure and mechanism of the eye, and every part thereof, so well fitted and adapted as not the least curiosity can be added." In other words, living things were God's perfect machines. And he even worried about male nipples. He couldn't understand why God would make male nipples. And that captures the pan-adaptation of John Ray. And it remained a tradition in Anglophone biology all the way from the 17th century, all the way down to our time. So growing up in Northern England in a fundamentalist Christian home, Paley's natural theology was sort of my Bible. Paley just reiterated John Ray's message. According to Paley, organisms are God's contrivances and profoundly analogous again to human machines, in which every component serves some adaptive function, and which all are fashioned to function together to serve the function of the whole. And the same message was repeated again in the famous Bridgewater treatises published in the 1830s. This is the Anglophone tradition. Everything in a living thing serves some function, and the living things are God's artifacts, God's machines, and the contingent assemblage represented by a living thing was put together by God. That was my worldview in high school in the north of England. Now, of course, living things do possess and exhibit adaptations. I mean, here are some. The streamlined shape of a dolphin, the teeth of a wolf, the wings of a seed, the shape of an enzymic site. These are all clearly adaptations to serve some end. And at times, the adaptations in the biological world are extraordinarily machine-like or analogous to our own artifacts. This is the famous bacterial flagellum, and this is the eye. So there's certainly, when I was at high school, I was always looking at these sorts of objects in the biological world to confirm my functionalist, mechanistic view of nature, and to confirm in the wonder of some of these adaptations the creative actions of God. Well, Darwin, true to his Anglophone traditions, was also a convinced mechanist. Organisms for Darwin were also, as they were for Ray and as they were for Paley, living machines. There's no difference. The fundamental paradigm of functionalism persisted right away down from Ray, right away down to modern intelligent designers today. It hasn't changed. Darwin didn't do anything particularly new. He just adopted the Anglophone functionalism and gave it another explanation. Just to quote Darwin, he said, "If a man were to make a machine for some special purpose, but would use old wheels, springs, and pulleys, the whole machine, with all its parts, might be said to be specially contrived for its present purpose. Thus, throughout nature, almost every part," hear the echo of John Ray, "every part of every living creature has probably served in a slightly modified condition for diverse purposes and has acted in the living machinery of many ancient and distinct forms." Could be John Ray. And again, Darwin says we see beautiful adaptations in the woodpecker, mistletoe, the feathers of a bird, in the plumed seed, which is wafted by the gentle breeze. In short, we see beautiful adaptations everywhere and in every part of the organic world. Is this a natural theologian or is it an agnostic scientist? And in The Origin, he said, "We may conclude that the structure of every living creature either now or is or was formerly of some direct or indirect use to its possessor," echoing again John Ray. And he says about the aim of The Origin, he sees adaptation as the primary phenomena that any evolutionary theory must explain. And it's the same today. Here we have John Ray resurrected in Dennett and Dawkins, okay? They also view organisms as mechanical systems. And as Dawkins put it in The Blind Watchmaker, each one of us is a machine, echoing Descartes, Ray, Paley, and Darwin again. And then he makes the absurd claim, like an airliner, but only much more complicated. So this is the Anglophone biological tradition. I was brought up in the high school in Northern England, in a Christian family. And my inference from the mechanistic paradigm was that God created living machines. Now, we come to an important point, a sort of a coda, a pause. If this view of the biological world is actually correct, if functionalism, which is almost the same as mechanism, holds biological order is extrinsic to nature, and the origin of organic forms is either by creation or natural selection. So it's either, if you hold to functionalism, you have Paley or you have Darwin. And it means, and this is the colossal import of Darwin's theory, which was emphasized by none other than his bulldog Thomas Huxley in the 19th century. If the world of life is an artifactual add-on to nature, then all the forms of life, including man, are contingent forms, artifacts of time and chance, and have no teleological or necessary connection with the cosmos as large. And that claim of Thomas Huxley defined secular biology since Darwin throughout the English-speaking world, and because of the dominance of English culture, really now throughout the entire world. But I'm not a philosopher, but I can see myself the enormous philosophical import if you accept the artifactual model of the biological world. Well, after high school, I went to Bristol Medical School. And at med school, like so many other young Christians brought up in fundamentalist families, I discovered evolution, and I discovered Darwin's alternative explanation for the artifactual order of the living world. And I became an evolutionist, and I became a Darwinist. But of course, my worldview was still functionalist and mechanistic. I just jumped ships in terms of the causation of this particular type of phenomenon. I was never, I must confess, a particularly enthusiastic Darwinist, but I had to accept that it was an alternative causal framework. However, after medical school, having become an evolutionist and a bit of a reluctant Darwinist, I started on an academic career which began in King's College in London in the late 60s, in the glory days of the DNA gene-centric era. And my PhD thesis was the development of the red blood cell. And just briefly, because I'm sure people here don't know much about the development of the red blood cell, but it occurs at the end of a long series of cell divisions from a primitive stem cell in the marrow through basophilic erythroblasts to an orthochromatic erythroblast, which then ejects its nucleus, and it becomes the enucleate classic mammalian erythrocyte. All mammals, all marsupials, all monotremes, all placentals have an enucleate erythrocyte, and this is one of the defining diagnostic features of the class Mammalia. It's an amazing process, the enucleation itself. If time permitted, I would go into it in detail, but it's peripheral to what I'm going to say now. The thing that struck me and all the other, I was working in King's biochemistry department. At that stage, we were extracting RNAs from mammalian cells to try and show that protein synthesis in mammalian systems was the same as in prokaryotic systems. So the whole lab was full of people studying the red cell and extracting RNA from it. Now, of course, everybody wondered why the mammalian red cell gets rid of its nucleus. And the first and foremost problem you have to explain, so if you're going to give an adaptive explanation for this, and this is what began to make me wonder about the pan-adaptationalism of my childhood and of the Anglophone tradition. Avian red cells have a nucleus, but birds have a higher metabolic, their metabolic rate is higher than mammals. If you look at a hummingbird with its heart beating 60 times a second, or you view geese flying over the Himalayas, you'll realize that birds have an amazing ability to develop, to transport oxygen to their tissues, to maintain high metabolic rates. So why did the mammals get rid of the nucleus? I mean, the actual process of getting rid of it itself is very difficult to explain in terms of Darwinian incremental functionalism, because we know the nucleus is either in or out the cell. And that was also another problem. But the major problem was, can you really give an adaptive explanation for the enucleate red cell, one of the most important defining features of living things on Earth? A peculiar feature was that also fetal erythroid cells are big and nucleated. At the time when, in fact, the fetus is hungry for oxygen, it's using large nucleated cells, even bigger than bird cells, nucleated bird cells. And then, to try and give an adaptive explanation for all the variation in red cell forms was simply impossible. Dogs and cats have different size, different diameter red cells. Horse, cow, and goat are different. Goat is quite a bit smaller than dog. Why? How can you explain in terms of functionalism these sorts of variations? And if you look at all the mammalian red cells, and this is an old diagram from a 19th century paper, you can see that some of them are absolutely tiny. So if the reason for getting rid of the nucleus was to assist the delivery of oxygen in the tissues through the capillaries, you'd imagine that there would be a huge selective pressure to decrease the size of the red cell. But in fact, it's all chaos. It's all over the place. And when you look at this fact and you think, well, here is one of the most important physiological functions on Earth, and you can't give a satisfying explanation in terms of Darwinian functionalism for the forms you see in front of you. You just have to give it up. But the funny thing is that when I was at King's thinking about this, I was continually saying to myself, how can I give an adaptive explanation for this phenomenon? I was imposing Anglophone adaptationalism on this particular phenomenon. Why? Why assume that everything has to be given an adaptive explanation? And basically, the fact is, I can say now 100%, nobody on Earth can give an adaptive explanation for the forms of erythrocytes in mammals, which performs the most important physiological function perhaps on Earth. It's an arresting fact. But still, despite the fact I could see the problems, I remained really quite functionalist all the time I was doing my PhD. I had this in front of me, but John Ray's ghost, Paley's ghost, Darwin's ghost was there, and I couldn't throw it off. However, after King's, I drifted into human genetics, became fascinated in the Genome Project, and got involved in collecting genes and finding diseased genes. And this brought me to Paris on a number of occasions, because in the late 80s, there was a number of gene mapping conferences in Paris. And I met a person who had a huge influence on my subsequent academic career, called Marcel Paul Schutzenberger, Marco for short, who knew him. He had a flat on the Rue de Rolag, sorry my French, oh my goodness, just off the Bois de Boulogne. And I used to stay with him on many occasions when I visited Paris. Marco Schutzenberger was one of the leading intellectuals in Paris, and he was a long-time critic of Darwinian theory. And he was, in all the meetings I had with him, he was drawing me away from functionalism. On many occasions, we'd go into the Bois de Boulogne, the Jardin des Plantes, and he'd say to me, Mike, look at all the forms of leaves. There's 250,000 angiosperm species on the planet. Every one of them has a specially shaped leaf, has a specially shaped petal, and so that you've got millions now of forms. They are they are reliably reproduced all the time, on trillions of occasions. They never vary, and yet I'm not sure that you can give an adaptive explanation for any of these, for any leaf form some aspects of leaves are adaptive, that's true, but the actual geometry of the leaves you can't give an explanation for. And so many times I was going around the Bois de Boulogne with Marco, and he's pointing to all these different patterns of the leaves, you see, and saying, Mike, forget functionalism, you can't explain it. The botanical realm is completely beyond any form of functionalist explanation. I mean, you might look at the Fibonacci series, which defines petal numbers in a number of species of flowers. Some daisies have 13 petals, some have 21 petals, some have 34. What adaptive explanation could you possibly give for these sorts of abstract patterns? Why would black-eyed Susan find 13 petals adaptive, whereas a Shasta daisy would find 21 petals adaptive? There has to be other explanations, other causal explanations, other than Darwinian functionalism. And of course, there's all the various phylotaxic patterns in nature as well. So what we have in the botanical realm seems to be forms without any specific function. Now, you cannot explain, in terms of Darwinian adaptationalism, you cannot explain forms without a specific function, because Darwinism works on a particular organism in a particular environment. So how are you going to explain the millions of unique, diverse forms of leaves? Now, I'll tell you another strange thing. Just as the red cell phenomena has never been explained, neither have the forms of leaves. It's amazing. I don't think you could find a paper anywhere which would take a maple leaf and explain just how selection molded all those little forms around the edge of the leaf. It's impossible. I don't know the paper exists. Perhaps it was written last week or something, but I don't know of it. So the botanical realm is right outside of Darwinism completely. And Marco not only was critiquing the functionalist view by taking me around the Bois de Boulogne, he also introduced me to a worldview which I had no idea about as an Anglophone biologist. It's called the structuralist or formalist worldview. And I'm embarrassed to say that I got to my sort of late 40s without any knowledge of one of the great traditions in the biological sciences. But it was a continental tradition, and it really is almost invisible in the training of biologists or medics in the English-speaking world. This is the structuralist worldview, based on the presumption that a significant proportion of biological complexity arises lawfully, like that of other natural forms, such as atoms or crystals, the result of natural self-organizing processes of matter. Life's order is not, according to structuralism, all contingent, but a significant fraction is part of the changeless order of nature and the paths of evolution determined by natural law. So this is a completely different worldview. Now, from the very outset, I have to stress that structuralists don't deny adaptations exist in living things. But what they say is there's a significant amount of order in all living things, which is in fact natural, not artifactual, and it's generated by emergent natural processes in living systems, intrinsic to the living things themselves, ultimately from the properties of matter. So they're not saying there's no adaptation, but that there is another important component of biological order, which is natural. And then I was amazed in talking to Marco to learn just how great the biologists were that are described to this structuralist view. Starts with Goethe, goes through Geoffroy, Schwann, the developer of cell theory, Richard Owen, who was the leading comparative anatomist in 19th century England. This is Haeckel, and this is, of course, Darcy Thompson. So there was, unknown to me, there was a long tradition of great biologists who ascribed to a structuralist formalist view of the world that there was a significant amount of natural order in biological systems. In the 19th century, structuralism was all laws of form. Many biologists before Darwin's, as Mary Windsor tells us, seemed to feel that although their field was not yet as exact, coherent, and logical as Newtonian science, it had the potential of becoming so. The role of the scientist was to discover within the confusing diversity of living things the underlying order and lawfulness. So according to the structuralist paradigm, as opposed to the functionalist one, organic forms are generated by at least a fraction of the order by special bio-laws of form. It's just as you have the laws of crystallography, the laws of chemistry, which allow for a rational deductive derivation of all possible crystals and atoms, so there would be, when biological science advanced far enough, you would find the particular categories of biomatter self-organize into particular forms in biological systems. And the emergence of these forms would be determined by laws analogous to those of chemistry and crystallography. This was the laws of form biology. And as I say, in talking to Marco and learning of the structuralist worldview, the structuralist tradition, I was absolutely amazed that there was this huge alternative view of the world, which I'd never really heard of as an Anglophone biologist. A recent structuralist was Brian Goodwin, and he summarized his aims, and he captures some of the essence of the structuralist worldview. He summarizes his aims as looking for a logical and rational taxonomy of forms based on their generative dynamics. This would give us, within a small corner of taxonomy, a theory of biological forms, those equivalent in physics to the periodic table of elements. I can't think of a worldview as radically different to that of functionalism, either creationist functionalism or Darwinian functionalism, as those few sentences from Brian Goodwin. Naturally, seeing some of the order of biology was generated by natural law, by laws of form, the crystal was a very popular metaphor. In Schwann's last chapter of Microscopical Researches, he says the process of crystallization in organic nature is the nearest analog to the formation of cells. Should we not therefore be justified in putting forward the proposition that the formation of the elementary parts of organisms is nothing but a crystallization, and the organism nothing but an aggregate of such crystals, which must combine, according to certain laws, so as to form a systematic whole similar to an organism? And Owen himself, he used the analogy of a crystal unambiguously in the final chapter of his classic Anatomy of Vertebrates, still perhaps one of the best anatomy texts on the vertebrates has ever been written. In the context of a discussion of the causes of segmentation, he says, the repetition of similar segments in a vertebral column and of similar elements in a vertebral segment is analogous to the repetition of similar crystals. This is the formalist structuralist worldview. The patterns of nature are arising intrinsically from the properties of biomatter. So here we have two great worldviews, structuralism and functionalism. And after my experience with the red cell in King's, and after many walks in the garden in the Bois de Boulogne, I could come to see structuralism more and more as a plausible worldview. You may know, I'm sure everybody in France will know, that in fact, in the 19th century, there was a famous debate held in the Academy of Sciences in Paris between Geoffroy, the structuralist, and Cuvier, the functionalist. And how amazing that biologists can look at the same evidence and come to completely different, diametrically opposed worldviews. It's fascinating. And Gould summed up the two paradigms. Most organisms are well adapted to their immediate environment, but also built on anatomical ground plans that transcend any particular circumstance. Problem for Darwinism. Things that transcend particular circumstances can't be explained in terms of Galapagos-type Darwinian evolution. Yet the two principles seem opposed in a curious sense. For why should structures adapted for particular ends root their basic structure in homologues that do not now express any common function? The designation of one principle, structuralism or functionalism, or the other, as the causal foundation of biology, virtually defines the position of any scientist towards the organic world and its causes of order. And I think perhaps people here will know that Gould started his career as an ardent functionalist. And yet, if you read his last great work on evolutionary theory, the structure of evolutionary theory, he confesses his increasing interest and in structuralist and formalist ideas. And one wonders, in fact, unfortunately, Gould died shortly after he published this book from which these quotes are taken. And I wonder what would have happened if Gould had lived a bit further, because he was clearly moving very quickly towards a structuralist, formalist view of nature. Now, the essential claim of the structuralist worldview is that there are basic ground plans underlying the adaptive complexity of life, and that these ground plans never served any particular function in any specific organism in any specific environment. And therefore their causation cannot be adaptation. That was the core idea of the structuralist view. And you can see here that there is in all tetrapod limbs, hind and forelimbs, in your hind limb and your forelimb, you'll see the same exact design. And it's amazing. Even the muscles used to move the fingers and the toes are almost exactly the same. There are some slight differences in the anatomy, muscular anatomy of the hand and foot, but they're very slight. Amazing. Completely different adaptive structures are based on an underlying form which has remained unchanged for 400 million years in tetrapod evolution. So behind the whale's fin, the frog's limbs, the horse's hoof, the bat's wing is exactly the same design. It's unchanged in 400 million years, and it never seems to have served any specific function. This is just like one of those leaf forms in the Bois de Boulogne. It's the same problem. And we might take the angiosperm flowers back to the Bois de Boulogne. Again, echoing many conversations with Marco in the garden, there is a basic ground plan to the angiosperm flower, consisting of a series of sepals, of petals, then of stamens, and the carpel in the middle. Every single flower conforms to this pattern, which has been present for 120 to 140 million years on Earth, and it's never changed. So you have another unchanging pattern for which nobody has ever given any adaptive explanation for how it came about. Insects also, fantastically diverse, and yet they're all based on the same basic plan. 3 body parts, 3 thoracic segments, no more than 11 abdominal segments, three limbs of identical design stuck on the thorax. And if you have a look at the limbs, again, we find a common, deep pattern on which all limbs are based, consisting of coxa, trochanter, femur, tibia, tarsus. And these components occur in every single insect limb, despite the millions of insect species and the fantastic diversity, adaptive diversity of insect limbs underneath the unchanging pattern of the pattern of the insect limb. Many ground plans have strange numeric or geometric characters. Octopus have 8 limbs, squid have 10. Trying to give that an adaptive explanation. There's many coelenterids have 8-fold radial symmetries. And of course, starfish has 5 limbs. None of these features can you ever put down to any specific environment in the history of the world that called forth that particular pattern. The mammalian spine, similarly, there are 7 cervical vertebrae in the great majority of all mammalian species. Giraffe has 7, a cat has 7, a dog has 7, and a whale has 7. Mammalian teeth conform to an extraordinary numeric pattern. You have 3 incisors, one canine, 4 premolars, and 3 molars, 44 teeth. No placental mammal in 150 million years has ever transgressed that basic formula. So something deep inside the mammal is constraining that pattern. Marsupials have a different pattern, but again, it's never exceeded. We can go to butterflies, and there's a basic ground plan to nearly all butterfly wings. And again, just like all the other ground plans, biology has never provided an explanation for them. I'll come to what Darwin said about it in a minute. This is a beautiful one. Insect wing venation. It's very complicated. It's a beautiful patterning, and it's also remained constant for tens and hundreds of millions of years. So you get the 1, 2, 5 pattern of the pentadactyl limb. You get the concentric whorls of the flower. You get the insect body plan, ground plan. You get the 7 cervical, blah, blah. You get the structure of the insect limb. So you get these basic underlying patterns on which adaptive diversity is built, but the patterns themselves remain unchanged, just like crystals. And so the biologists like Owen, like Geoffroy, they looked upon these homologs as natural forms. The homologs had remained unchanged, and I think that it was a very sensible inference to make. The homologs remained unchanged in diverse lineages for hundreds of millions of years, And given their non-adaptive abstract appearance, what else could they be but natural forms? Moreover, most are not led up to by any known transitional forms, and in most cases, a Darwinian explanation simply has never been provided. So, Geoffroy's verdict on these deep homologous patterns was that he said that he assumed them to have powers analogous to atoms and other unalterable elements of the physical world. And if you want to get a fantastic manifesto against functionalism, you should read Richard Owen's great book on the nature of limbs. He devastates the notion that you can give any adaptive explanation in any sense for either the origin or the persistence of this pattern in so many diverse tetrapods. And it's an incredible book. Marco said, Mike, you've got to read this book, and I did. And it was one of those things which really was a critical point. Once I'd read that book, I thought, yes, there is causal factors in the biological world which transcend adaptation, which have nothing to do with adaptation. And because Owen posed such an existential threat to Darwinism, when they opened the new Darwin Centre 2009 in London, actually, ironically, in the museum that was founded by Owen, it's extraordinary. They had to move his statue to somewhere sort of less prominent, you know, and they put Darwin's statue at the head of the staircase where Owen had stood. Because the fact is that the structuralist perspective of nature poses an existential threat to Darwinism. It's not just those millions of leaf forms. It's now all these deep homologies in nature which have remained unchanged, and in the case of hardly any of them can you give an adaptive explanation. So what did Darwin say about this in The Origin? This is absolutely amazing. Just like me at King's, when I was trying to give an adaptive explanation for all these puzzling size differences in mammalian erythrocytes, he waves the whole problem away. He doesn't look at it. He says, there must have been adaptive in some ancestral form. And he then introduced into biology the strange idea that just because something is inherited from an ancestor, you can explain the causal factors involved in its origin. And if you read if you look at The Origin of Species, only in a few places does he make this point, but he makes the point very clearly. He clearly misunderstood Owen's On the Nature of Limbs. Because Owen was saying there is no conceivable environment, no conceivable organism in which this particular pattern could have been adaptive in the hind and forelimb. Period. You can't do it. Darwin doesn't answer that in The Origin. And the reason is, as I experienced myself as an Anglophone biologist, one is so immersed in this pan-adaptational idea. If you see a phenomenon, the first thing you do is, what function did it serve? What purpose does it have? It's an amazing, it's the ghost of John Ray again, extending right through those centuries from the 17th century. Anyway, the people who organized the Darwin celebration in London, they recognized Owen's existential threat, and they moved his statue. Now, I said earlier that one of the significant things about the Darwinian revolution was that if you accept it, as Huxley said, then living things on Earth are contingent forms. But now, if you accept this particular view, and you accept that the idea that, in fact, natural laws of form, have played some significant role in the generation of biological systems, then the forms of life on Earth, up to and including humans, can be seen to have be a lawful and natural part of the universe itself. It means that life on Earth recovers at least some integral place in the natural order. So it's a fantastically significant philosophical change from the contingent thesis of Darwin to the sort of lawful forms thesis of structuralist biology. Okay, how much time have I got left now? Is it? Okay, that is okay. Well, another thing that I read one day in Marco's flat in Paris was Lawrence Henderson's Fitness of the Environment. He made a photocopy of the book, he had a copy of the book, and he said, Mike, you must also read this book. You can see that Marco was a bit of a guru of mine in those days. And I opened the fitness, and it was like a road to Damascus experience, because Henderson goes into all sorts of fine-tuning for the physiology, for human physiology. And it's so amazing. I mean, I can't expand on it here, but as you're sitting there breathing, you're taking in oxygen, and how convenient you breathe out the waste as a gas, CO2. And if you look at the way that CO2 and water react, you get a buffer which is perfect for maintaining homeostasis in beings like ourselves. This was all in Henderson. And I read it and I was absolutely amazed, because I've done stints in intensive care. So, I know how beautiful the fitness of nature is for maintaining human respiratory physiology. And I read the book and I was amazed, but the take-home message I got was, if the universe is so fit for biological systems like ourselves, surely there will be, in the end, we'll discover laws of form. Surely the forms of life must also be fine-tuned into nature as well. I mean, that's congruous with Henderson's argument. So the first point I'd like to make, after the presentation of the deep homologies in nature, after the Bois de Boulogne, is the idea that the fine-tuning of nature for life on Earth, and everybody sort of accepts this now, but if you look at Henderson, you'll find the fine-tuning goes a lot farther than simple carbon-based life. It goes on to advanced organisms like ourselves. That lends itself to the idea that life, it's not just the environment of life that's been fine-tuned, it's also for more. And that's exactly what the structuralists are saying. And of course, everybody knows the famous quote by Hoyle: a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. So anyway, that was what I took home from reading Henderson. I thought the fitness is so extraordinary. Surely the structuralists must be right. 5 minutes, wow. Ooh, wow. 10 minutes, okay. Okay, so I'm now moving on to a later phase in my life at Otago University in New Zealand, when I was studying human genetics in India. I had a sort of an epiphany about the nature of proteins. I was already by that stage into a nouveau structuralist view of the world, and I was starting to look for evidence for structuralism in the world. And I can remember I was walking along the corridor in the biochem department there, and I suddenly realized that the self-organization and folding of proteins into the 1,000 defined forms that they do is the laws of form, just like the 19th century biologists were looking for. And just let me explain this. A protein is a complex folded system, and it starts off as a linear amino acid sequence, and the linear amino acid sequence folds into what is called an alpha helix and a beta sheet. And then they combine together to form the fold, the protein fold. And these are two folds. You can see the two motifs here. The flat plates are beta sheets, and the alpha helixes are obviously the helixes in there. So that, in fact, you can see that proteins are made up of these sorts of structures. And if you look at a lot of proteins, you find they're all made up of these structures. But this is the wonderful thing about this, absolutely wonderful, and that is that, in fact, over the last 20 to 30 years, the rules of protein folding have been worked out. And it's clear that the number of ways you can arrange alpha helices is limited by all sorts of physical constraints. And the number of ways you can fold beta sheets is also limited. So here are rules of protein folding. Let's call them laws of protein form, which are nothing to do with adaptation. Note, nothing to do with adaptation. This is physics. This is structuralism, okay? And just to remind you what Brian Goodwin said, he said he was looking for a theory of biological forms whose equivalent in physics is the periodic table of elements. Well, this is it. This is taken from a paper I wrote in the Journal of Theoretical Biology, the periodic table of 1,000 protein forms. Every one of these forms is a non-adaptive abstract pattern, like those leaves in the Bois de Boulogne. 70% of everybody's body in this place is made of proteins. 70% of the biomass of the planet is generated by laws of form. Exactly analogous to the laws of form that Brian Goodwin was looking for and that the 19th century biologists were looking for. Beautiful story. I was so excited when I realized this, I immediately rushed off a paper to Nature and wrote the sort of thing where it's like an epiphany, you write it overnight, wrote off to Nature. They knocked the paper back quite recently, but they eventually asked me to do a concepts column, which I did, Laws of Form Revisited. So that was a beautiful, and after this experience, I was now a confirmed structuralist. So I'd gone from a creationist in Northern England at high school to a sort of Darwinist, reluctant Darwinist at med school, to a gradual erosion of that functionalist view through my own PhD at King's, through walking in the Bois de Boulogne, through thinking of the basic deep homologies in nature. Okay, so then I started looking at other things, and it's all over the place. Lipid membranes are also self-organizing natural forms. My work in India on human genetics was looking for diseases which cause abnormalities in the photoreceptors in the mammalian retina. And one of the things that's staggering about the light detecting part of the cell is it's a huge stack of about 1,200 lipid membranes. Okay, and that's clearly another self-organized form. Here we see it again. And if you say, well, are membranes really lawful forms? You can take a solution and you can put a lipid solution in, you can make a solution of lipids. As you increase the concentration of lipids, you go through a series of forms, and guess what? The final form is exactly the same as the photoreceptor. You can do that in a test tube, okay? So membrane forms throughout biology are also lawful, like the protein folds. Now, I'm running out of time, so 5 minutes. Thank you, John. There's many other self-organized natural forms in biological systems. Nearly all the microtubular forms, for instance, the aster, that's entirely self-organized. None of these forms are in the gene. I mean, the three-dimensional atomic deployment in space in a protein isn't in the genes. The photoreceptor outer segment, those things, is not in the genes. In that case, I know it's not in the genes because the photoreceptor of the mammal has been subjected to an exhaustive genetic analysis. And we've never found any genes which are involved in specifying that complex morphology. It's clearly a self-organized form. Now, I have to summarize something now because I can't give a long sort of 3 or 4 hour discourse about the state of modern biology. But biology today, I think, is not controversial to say. It's moving away from a gene-centric 20th century biology towards a new epigenetic biology. And as this is happening, life's order increasingly is not specified in genes, but results from the self-organizing emergent properties of biomatter. Does that mean that all those homologies I talked about are natural forms determined by laws of form? Well, no, it doesn't mean that yet. That's a topic for 21st century research to come. But what it is this is exactly the move you would want to see in biology if it turns out that living systems are part of nature and are determined by self-organizing phenomena and laws of form. This is the move you'd want to see. And so, of course, it's only the beginning of this move, but in the end, it could well lead to the elucidation of the underlying causal factors in all those deep homologies that were such a source of wonderment to 19th century biology. Oops, sorry. So basically, one other point, 2 points before I'm finishing. One of the things that's come out of the last 20 years of evo-devo research is that the homologs, like the pentadactyl limb, the flower, or the insect body plan, they haven't just remained unchanged in lineages of hundreds of millions of years. The actual generative factors have changed enormously. In other words, if you want to make a beetle, you've got a number of options. You can use what is called the short-term band route, or you can use the long-term band route. In one case, the segments are laid down simultaneously. We're talking about in beetles now, closely related organisms. In another case, the segments are generated temporally in a sequence over time. But the end product is exactly the same form. Now, this result is now being multiplied thousands of times in Evo Devo. In other words, all those forms that were of such a wonderment to 19th century biology are now being found to be generated by all sorts of different mechanisms. So not only do they remain unchanged in diverse lineages for time beyond human recall, they are generated in all sorts of different ways. Well, for me, that's powerful circumstantial evidence that they are indeed generated by laws of form and our natural forms as was believed in the 19th century. Finally, the origin of life. Laboratory efforts have uncovered novel physical mechanisms for the emergence of homochirality, the concentration and purification of prebiotic building blocks, and the ability of the first cells to assemble, grow, divide, and acquire great complexity. In the absence of evolved biochemical capabilities, such physical processes likely played an essential role in early biology. Do you know who said that? Jack Szostak, one of the leading origin of life researchers. He is sort of conceding in this that you are going to have help from nature to go from chemistry to the cell. And I'm absolutely sure he's right. People talk about an RNA world. Okay, an RNA world, and they say, well, that was one of the routes to life. That's controversial, of course. There's other propositions. But if it was the RNA world, the fact that there is a molecule which carries information and also can carry out enzymic activity is a gift of nature. Nature did it. And when you take these facts into consideration, with the other fact that in meteors like the Murchison meteor and in studies of organics in space, the universe is full of organic compounds, and some of them are the actual constituents of the biopolymers on Earth. So the fact that there's an RNA world, the fact that people like Szostak are thinking, well, perhaps nature lent a hand, this would be absolutely beautiful. I mean, if it turns out that the origin of life is a process built into nature, that would revolutionize everybody's thinking about biology, just about as much as finding life in another planet. It would be a revolutionary endorsement of Geoffroy, of Goethe, of Schwann and Owen, and 19th century biology, that there is an input from nature in the generation of the biological world. So, from a creationist in Newcastle in Northern England to a convinced structuralist here in Paris now, I've made a total intellectual transition. And that's about the end of it, but I perhaps should make another point here, which other speakers have made in this meeting. It's strange that humans were so fascinated in the mechanistic view, the Cartesian view, the view of Ray. Because when you think about it, we have mind and sentience, and this has been discussed extensively in this meeting. As far as I'm concerned, I can't understand how a machine could ever have mind and sentience. Although I may be corrected someday, but nonetheless, it seems to me that at the moment, there's a failure of simulation. And I can't understand why this was such a powerful metaphor, the metaphor of the machine in the biological sciences. And the other thing, of course, that living things never do is self-reproduction. Christina, the Queen of Sweden, on hearing Descartes, you know the quote, see that it produces offspring. So neither self-reproduction nor mind and sentience have ever been seen. And now, I was going to, And so, going from life as an artifact of time and chance, I have progressed through my intellectual journey in the biological sciences to a view of seeing life and man in the cosmos as necessary and integral parts of nature. And that's the message of the structuralist tradition, and it's the position that I'm sort of been more and more attracted to throughout my academic career. Thank you very much.
Vous vous rendez compte la chance qu'on a eue ce matin? On a vu 3 révolutions d'affilée, hein. Les révolutions possibles derrière la physique quantique, les révolutions possibles derrière les neurosciences et maintenant les révolutions possibles derrière la vie. Ce qu'a dit Michael Danton, c'est qu'il y a eu 2 traditions à l'origine de la vie. Et on ne parle pas des créationnistes, non, on parle du structuralisme, l'idée que, en fait, si on a 5 doigts, pour des fonctionnalistes, c'est parce que 5 c'est mieux que 6 ou mieux que 4. Donc on a été sélectionné un lointain ancêtre, c'était mieux pour y avoir 5 doigts que 4 ou 6. Et c'est pour ça que tous les vertébrés terrestres, sauf les chevaux qui en ont perdu et d'autres, ont 5 doigts. Tandis qu'un structuraliste vous dira que 5, c'est quelque chose qui est, le chiffre 5, l'ordre, c'est un ordre de la nature, c'est inscrit dans les lois de la nature. Donc c'était inscription dans les lois de la nature contre adaptation, à ce qu'il appelait le fonctionnalisme. Et ce qu'il a montré, c'est qu'à l'époque de Darwin, il y avait Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, dans la rue qui est le Muséum d'histoire naturelle porte son nom, il y avait Goethe, il y avait un certain nombre de structuralistes. Ensuite, Darwin est passé par là, et on a toute la vision fonctionnaliste et mécaniste. On a beaucoup aimé, je pense, quand ils ont montré qu'on est obligé d'enlever la statue de Owen pour ne pas gêner Darwin, un grand structuraliste comme Richard Owen. Et aujourd'hui, donc, ce qu'il nous a montré, c'est ce retour à une nouvelle vision de la vie qui est une potentielle révolution là aussi.